A question that often comes back is multiverse. What comics do you read? Let's find out. Hello, heroes and villains. Welcome to Multiverse. There's James Gunn who announced an Authority movie, and since then, there's a lot of people who have been asking, what the heck is the Authority? Let's try to find out. Long before we had the boys, long before we had the Ultimates, we had the Authority. You could almost see the Authority as the blueprint that Mark Miller and Brian H. used when they came up with the Marvel Ultimates. So if you are a big fan of the Marvel Ultimates, this was pretty much the prototype that led to the Marvel Ultimates. Although it did not start with the Authority. Ironically enough, it started with another book called Stormwatch. When a whole bunch of guys left Marvel to create Image Comics, Jim Lee created a comic known as Wildcats, but he created also another comic known as Stormwatch, although people still remember Wildcats, but somehow Stormwatch pretty much is forgotten at this point. Stormwatch wasn't a bad book. It was trying, it was trying a few things at the time. Although it did what pretty much every group comics were doing way back when. Basically, Stormwatch were a secret organization that was kind of working for the government somehow. Pretty much every superhero groups way back when at the time were pretty much paramilitary groups that were somehow working from some government. And Stormwatch was one of those groups. The series wasn't bad, but it probably wasn't that successful, seeing how they decided to cancel it and then relaunch it as the Authority. And the way they did cancel it was a bit strange, I suppose. It was kind of cancelled into a Stormwatch Alien crossover, and then like half of the group of Stormwatch was killed in that comic, and the other half that left was relaunched with the Authority, and then they added a few new members. And at the time, people were scratching their heads a little bit because basically they were relaunching the book with the same writer, the same artist, basically the same creative team, and more or less the same group with just a few members that changed. But there's one thing that will be changed. They came up with what became known later on as widescreen comics. Basically, comics on the scale of an epic movie like Independence Day or something like that. So today we will take a quick look at the Authority Volume 1. We'll take a look at Volume 2 in a future video. So basically with the Authority, they were trying to make it, to make something more cinematics in terms of comics, and also something of an epic scale, like again, an epic movie like Independence Day. And later on, the Ultimates would try something similar, but they would pretty much start with something pretty much lifted from Saving Private Ryan. But in here, we had pretty much an epic story where you had high stakes, you had basically some army of evil supervillains, basically destroying entire cities and taking over the world, or something like that. So they were trying to come up with a comic of an epic scale, a global scale, and with epic visual, with a sense of grandeur, which again later on would pretty much be known as widescreen comics, as if you were watching an epic movie on a movie screen in widescreen, obviously. And the first issue was fairly basic. It would pretty much introduce you to the group, to the settings, to the new aircraft that the Authority were using, and all that good stuff. And basically we would go through each members as they were being introduced into the team. If you had read the Stormwatch comic previously, you were kind of familiar with some of those characters already. But even if you did not read the Stormwatch comic before that, you were not lost because pretty much everything was reintroduced in that comic. For example, in the case of Midnighter and Apollo, these characters had already been introduced in the Stormwatch comic, but again, even if you had not read the comic, they were pretty much reintroduced within the pages of the Authority. Basically within the first issue, you know who these guys were. So basically these were what if Superman and Batman were together. So basically we had gay Superman and gay Batman, long before DC were trying to do that in their own comics. Now, we keep on being told that we need more representation in comics, and lately DC have been trying to turn Superman, yeah, it was Superman's son, but they still named him Superman, so they were trying to kind of fool people into thinking that Superman was gay somehow. But we already had gay Superman way back when, like this was in the 90s, and we already had gay Superman, and DC has had gay Superman as part of their characters for a long time now. and they're not doing anything with it. They could easily make an Apollo comic. If they really wanted to make a comic about a gay Superman, make an Apollo comic. But that's not really what they want. The same with Batman. Again, way back when, we already had the Midnighter, who was basically gay Batman. So DC have been pushing to turn Tim Drake gay, to turn. They've been trying to turn Batman into like bi-curious, which is probably just a stepping stone towards trying to make Batman gay somehow. And it's nothing new. It's something that's been going on for a long, long time. When I was a young kid, already way back when, people were trying to push the idea that Batman and Robin were gay and they were a couple. So it's nothing new, sadly. But they already have a gay Batman. They have the Midnighter. We could easily have an awesome epic series with the Midnighter as gay Batman. But somehow that's not really what they want. They claim they want diversity, but somehow they don't use the diversity that they already have. All they have in mind is to try to change already established characters into gay characters when they already have gay characters, but somehow they do not use those characters. Go figure. And then you get introduced to the Carrier. I basically think of the Shield helicarrier, but what if it traveled between universes? Obviously, they've established that in the multiverse there was this thing called the Bleed, which is pretty much the space between universes, if it makes any sense. And the carrier could travel through the Bleed, and technically could travel from universe to universes, which is something that would be used a bit more later in the story. So again, they were trying to make this an epic story with huge consequences, and they were not afraid to destroy entire cities if they needed to. And basically, the Authority was a more edgier version of the Justice League. The Justice League were not afraid to do what needed to be done, even if it meant breaking the neck of their adversaries. Again, I'm pretty sure when they made Man of Steel, and they took some inspiration from the Authority. So the first issue would pretty much be an introduction to the whole team, and then by the end of the story, the whole team's together, ready to face off the evil army of supervillains trying to destroy the world, or something like that. Depending on your perspective, some people might think that this was pretty much Brian Hitch's best artwork. Some other people might prefer the work he did in the Marvel Ultimates. Although in the Marvel Ultimates, it did seem to rely heavily on using photographs, although he probably was using photographs already way back when. But in the Marvel Ultimates, he ended up using a lot of photographs lifted from movies like Saving Private Ryan's. Like when you read especially the first issue of the Authority, you see frames and shots lifted directly from Saving Private Ryan. He literally traced some of those shots. So you have to wonder if maybe he was already doing that way back when during the Authority, and he just wasn't doing it as well, or maybe he wasn't doing it quite as much way back when. But again, basically they ended up you making something that was pretty much of an epic scale, with invasions from armies of evil supervillains, or invasions from armies from another universe or another parallel reality, or some threat from some evil monsters from the moon. The sky's the limit, literally. Although in retrospect, I guess if you never saw the Authority before and you start reading it today, some of it will probably feel a bit familiar because a lot of those ideas have been reused by other people afterwards. And heck, again, that's pretty much what Mark Millar and Brian Hitch based the Marvel Ultimates on. They pretty much took the Authority, took one step further, made it into a sort of alternate version of the Marvel Universe, and there you go, you had the Ultimates. So it might suffer from the John Carter syndrome. John Carter is something that influenced a lot of stuff that came after it. Like John Carter is a book from the late 1800s, and it influenced a lot of things. A lot of things were inspired by John Carter, like Superman, Flash Gordon, Star Wars, and more. And sadly, in retrospect, when people saw the John Carter movie, of course they thought it ripped off Superman. They thought it ripped off Star Wars. They thought it ripped off a lot of stuff that actually came after John Carter. Sadly, when people get familiar with something first, to them that is what came first. So people who knew Star Wars, when they saw John Carter, they thought, I think they're ripping off Star Wars a little bit. Or some people probably thought that they were ripping off Superman, seeing how John Carter could leap tall buildings in a single bound. But it was the other way around. But again, people were probably familiar with Superman first, and then they discovered John Carter, and they probably saw John Carter as some sort of ripoff. And the same might happen with the Authority. You have to wonder if James Gunn will try to change or update the Authority a little bit so that it doesn't end up looking like a ripoff from The Boys or a ripoff from the Marvel Ultimates. I guess we're gonna have to wait and see. I know that a lot of people were puzzled that James Gunn announced an Authority movie, especially seeing how they're announcing an Authority movie when we don't even have a Justice League movie just yet. But I can sort of understand why James Gunn is doing that. Basically, again, as I mentioned, the Authority was the blueprint for the Marvel Ultimates, and a lot of the MCU was pretty much inspired, if not directly lifted, from the Marvel Ultimates. There seems to be a lot of people who think that the MCU success is because they based a lot of it on the Marvel Ultimates. So I could easily see DC thinking, hey, we have our own Marvel Ultimates. Why not inspire ourselves from those comics? And here we are. I did not say too much about the story itself because I want you to be able to read those comics and enjoy those comics. Basically, I'm trying to give as little spoilers as possible. Another thing also that might seem familiar, if you ever saw Superman versus the Elite, that is pretty much what it was inspired from. Basically, the Elite was the DC version of the Authority. At that time, DC did not own the Authority just yet. I don't think they had purchased the Wildstorm just yet. So wanted to have a storyline where Superman would be facing off against the Authority. So they came up with the Elite as a DC version of the Authority. And the idea was to show the contrast between Superman, a classic superhero, versus the Authority, a more modern, more cynical take on superhero comics. So it was basically a storyline showing a classic character versus a more modern group of characters, and showing the contrast between the two. So some people are thinking that James Gunn wants to make a Superman versus the Elite story at some point, but seeing how they actually own the Authority, there's no reason to use the Elite. They can just use the original group, the Authority. Although I wouldn't be surprised if somehow they end up doing a mishmash, maybe of the Authority and the Elite. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a Manchester Black and the new version of the Authority. I guess we're gonna have to wait and see. Although there's other rumors where people are thinking that what James Gunn really wants to do is Kingdom Come, and instead of using a whole bunch of generic characters like Alex Ross did in Kingdom Come, he's planning to use the Authority to fight Superman as opposed to a whole bunch of random superheroes that nobody knows about. I guess we're gonna have to wait and see for that. So if you were puzzled about the Authority, this might help you understand why DC and Warner decided to make an Authority movie, or why James Gunn decided to make an Authority movie. It's hard to know. It's hard to tell. Is it Warner who made that decision? Is it James Gunn who made that decision, or both? We'll never know. There was a Superman and the Authority comic made not too long ago. I would not recommend reading that comic. If you really want to read the Authority comic, I would suggest go back and read the original series. You should be able to get it easily enough on Amazon. And if you don't want to spend too much, you should be able to buy the Kindle version for fairly cheap. Again, once more on Amazon. Yeah, reading Kindle comics is a bit of a pain in the butt on PC. If you don't have a tablet, if you have a tablet, it's not an issue. You can zoom in easily enough with your tablet. With a PC, especially when you get a double spread page, it might be a bit tricky to be able to read the comic properly. But if you are on a budget and really want to read those comics, again, you can get them for fairly cheap as Kindle comics. So you decide if you want to spend a bit less and get them as Kindle comics, or if you're willing to pay a bit more and get the actual comics, the actual physical comics. You decide.